Clarice Hampton walked into the auditorium like no one had called her name. A black woman, full-figured, moving at her own deliberate pace. A gray sweater hugged her soft midsection. In her hands, a well-worn notebook, its spine frayed from years of turning. No one knew who she was. And for most in the room, that was all they needed to know. Up front, graduate students flipped through thick textbooks, tossing words at each other like trophies. Fourier transform, matrix decomposition, quantum bit entropy. In the back row, under the emergency exit sign, Clarice took a seat. No one spoke. No one had to. They glanced her way, then turned away. This was Ohio State University, a symposium on applied theoretical mathematics. And the man on stage was Dr. Leonard Drake, a pillar of academic math. Navy blazer, gold-rimmed glasses, silver hair slicked back like marble. He spun a piece of chalk between his fingers like a performer before the curtain rises. He didn't need to demand attention. He was the attention. Clarice opened her notebook, not to look busy, but because between the tiny handwritten lines was a world only she knew. She had no advanced degrees, no letters after her name. But math had always been there for her, a quiet flame that kept burning through late-night janitor shifts in empty labs, where she once secretly snapped photos of half-finished formulas left on whiteboards. Drake began his lecture. "Today," he said, his voice ringing like a bronze bell, "we will dismantle the outdated assumption that Riemannian transformations cannot be applied to quantum data analysis." Nods followed, excited tapping on desks. Clarice simply held her pen. As the lecture deepened, the room began to split, those who understood, and those pretending. Drake filled the board with symbols dense and dazzling, but wrong. Clarice knew, not because she guessed, but because she'd seen that exact model before, 3 years ago during a night shift, while rewriting the entire theory of functions in her own words for fun. "Any questions?" Drake asked, pointing his chalk like a cue stick, signaling no one should dare have any. No hands went up. Clarice felt her heartbeat. Her fingers trembled. Then, almost involuntarily, her hand rose. Necks turned. A voice from the middle row scoffed. "Is the janitor trying to ask something?" Drake narrowed his eyes. He looked down at Clarice, her simple gray sweater, the tattered notebook, her body overflowing the edges of the chair. "Yes, ma'am." His tone polite, razor-sharp polite. Clarice swallowed. "I was just wondering, in the fourth line of transformation." She pointed, using an alpha-axis function rotation under those boundary conditions. Wouldn't that disrupt the overall symmetry? Silence. A student murmured. What did she just say? Drake's mouth thinned. "Your name, Clarice Hampton. And which department are you with?" Clarice held his gaze. "I'm part of facilities. I clean the math building. But I've attended every symposium since 2021. Laughter erupted from the middle rows. A guy in a Princeton hoodie chuckled. "What? Does she think she's some kind of hidden math genius?" Drake gave a tight smile. "Well then, Ms. Hampton, if you spotted an inconsistency, please correct it." He stepped aside and offered her the chalk. Clarice stood. The murmurs swelled. She moved forward heavy, steady steps. The air in the hall tightened like a held breath. A black woman, overweight, no degree, walking toward a board meant for PhDs, surrounded by stares. She took the chalk. Drake raised his voice. "Let's try to keep this problem accessible for the layperson." Clarice didn't look at him. She looked at the board, and then she began to write. One stroke, then another. Her hand stopped shaking. Symbols flowed like water. Each step not just correct, but elegant, clean, minimal. The room fell into a hush so deep. You could hear the chalk click as she made the final mark. Clarice set the chalk down, took a step back. Drake stared at the board. 1 second. 2. 3. His brow furrowed. Then he said quietly, "An alternate approach. But correct." A ripple moved through the room. Phones came out. Some students just sat frozen. Clarice said nothing. She turned and walked back to her seat. But Drake wasn't done. "If that was so easy," he said, "then perhaps you can handle this." He scrawled a new equation larger, messier, bordering on nonsense to anyone unfamiliar with nonlinear quantum encryption algorithms. He looked at her. A challenge. Clarice stopped, turned. And once again, she stepped forward. After Clarice, no one else stepped up to the board. Drake didn't ask. The students didn't dare, and the scholars in the hall just sat there in silence, as if waiting to see whether what had just happened was real, or merely a crack in the illusion they'd built their careers around. Clarice returned to her seat in the back row, surrounded by stares, some startled, some suddenly avoiding her. No one sat next to her now, as if presence alone had become too much to share. Then Dr. Elena Morales, visiting professor from MIT, stood. She crossed the auditorium and sat directly beside Clarice. "May I see your notebook?" she asked softly. Her voice, that of a colleague, not a spectator. Clarice hesitated, then nodded. She handed over the worn notebook, spine bent, coffee-stained corners, its pages filled with handwritten symbols, unnamed hypotheses, and countless quantum variations she'd explored during third shift nights alone. Morales flipped through it slowly. She didn't speak, but her posture straightened, her eyes sharpened. By page 12, she stopped. "This," she murmured. "This is a primitive optimization of the quantum decay algorithm my team's developing. But you approached it completely differently. No citations, no references." Clarice lowered her eyes. "I didn't think anyone would read it." Morales looked up. "Well, now they'll have to at the front." Drake was trying awkwardly to restart the symposium. He called for the next student to continue presenting. No one moved. He tapped the chalk against the podium, jaw tightening. "We can't let a spontaneous performance derail academic rigor." Clarice said nothing, but Morales stood. "It wasn't performance," she said. "It was knowledge. It was genius-level intuition." She turned to Clarice. "Ms. Hampton, would you be willing to solve another?" Drake looked at Morales like she'd just betrayed the entire ivory tower. Clarice hesitated. Her heartbeat thudded against her throat. But she had stepped up once, and she knew if she walked away now, they wouldn't bury her because she lacked brilliance. They'd bury her because they wanted to forget. She nodded. And for the third time, she stepped forward. This time, no one laughed. No one scoffed. Only eyes followed her, as if witnessing something beyond math itself. Drake turned to the board. This wasn't a test. It was retaliation. He wrote a system of equations, unpublished work from a paper in contention, for a national prize. The problem was layered with 3 implicit variables: 1 time-shifting function, and a nonlinear inferential component. Clarice took the chalk. She stared, then turned to face him. "You're using the wrong rotational framework," she said plainly. "That's why your decay model won't converge." The room seemed to inhale. Drake flushed. "You don't know what dataset I'm working from. That formulation is based on 5 separate empirical studies." Clarice turned back and wrote 4 lines in rapid succession. "I know," she said, "because I modeled this last year in a simulated microsystem. It only converges if you replace the boundary condition with a cyclic symmetry composition." Morales stepped forward, scanning the 4 lines Clarice had written. Her eyes widened. "She's right," she said. "You just saved a collapsing hypothesis." Drake didn't speak. He stared at Clarice, like he was seeing her truly for the first time. No longer a cleaning lady. No longer plus-sized. No longer the outsider. Only one thing remained. A threat. Morales turned to the audience. "If this university doesn't admit her," she said clearly, "then the failure is the system's, not hers." A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then more. A few students rose to their feet not because they fully grasped what Clarice had done, but because they knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Clarice didn't smile. She didn't beam. She simply clutched her notebook to her chest and stepped down. She hadn't won yet. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible anymore. After Clarice, no one else approached the board. Drake didn't ask. The students didn't move. And the scholars in the room sat frozen, as if still processing whether what they had just seen was real, or simply a hairline fracture in the illusion they'd carried through their careers. Clarice remained in the back row, surrounded by sidelong glances and sudden avoidance. Strangely, no one dared sit beside her anymore. Then, Dr. Elena Morales, visiting professor from MIT, rose from her seat. She crossed the hall and took the empty chair next to Clarice. "May I see your notebook?" she asked. Her voice gentle-spoken not to a janitor, but to a colleague who had just walked off the stage. Clarice hesitated, then nodded. She handed over the worn notebook, its spine frayed, pages dotted with old coffee stains, filled with tight symbols, unnamed hypotheses, and endless quantum model variations she had worked through during graveyard shifts. Morales flipped through the pages slowly. She said nothing, but her back straightened. Her eyes sharpened. By page 12, she stopped. "This," she whispered. "This is a rudimentary optimization of a quantum decay algorithm my team's been developing. But you approached it through an entirely different path. No references. No academic source." Clarice pressed her lips together. "I didn't think anyone would read it." Morales looked up. "Well, now they'll have to. Up front." Drake was awkwardly trying to resume the session. He called on a student to continue presenting their thesis. No one moved. He tapped the chalk against the podium. His voice strained. "We cannot allow an impromptu demonstration to derail serious academic structure." Clarice said nothing, but Morales stood. "It wasn't a demonstration," she said. "It was knowledge. Genius-level intuition." She turned toward Clarice. "Ms. Hampton, would you be willing to solve one more?" Drake glared at her as if she had betrayed the entire academic institution. Clarice hesitated. She could feel her pulse climbing her throat, but she had stood up once. And she knew if she refused now, it wouldn't be because she lacked the skill. It would be because they wanted her forgotten. She nodded. And for the third time, she stepped up to the front of the room. This time, there were no snickers, no smirks, only eyes watching as if witnessing something that transcended mathematics. Drake turned to the board. This wasn't evaluation. It was revenge. He wrote a system of equations unpublished, pulled from a paper he was entering for a national research award. At its core, 3 implicit functions: 1 time-dependent variable, and a nonlinear inferential structure. Clarice picked up the chalk, stared, then turned around. "You used the wrong rotational framework," she said plainly. "That's why the decay model won't converge." The auditorium fell still. Drake flushed. "You don't know what data this is based on. These equations are informed by 5 experimental surveys." Clarice turned back to the board. She quickly wrote 4 lines. "I know," she said. "Because I ran this model last year in a simulated microsystem. It only converges when you swap the boundary condition for a cyclic symmetry set." Morales stepped forward. Skimming the 4 lines Clarice had just written, her eyes widened. "She's right," she said. "She just saved an entire hypothesis from collapse." Drake didn't speak. He stared at Clarice not as a cleaning woman, not as plus size, not as an outsider, but as something else entirely, a threat. Morales turned to his room. "If this university doesn't admit her," she said loudly, "then the failure belongs to the system, not to her." Applause broke the silence. Then more. A few students stood, not because they understood every equation Clarice had just corrected, but because they knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Clarice didn't smile. She didn't glow. She simply clutched her notebook to her chest and stepped down. She hadn't won, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't dismissed. 3 hours after the symposium, Clarice sat alone on a bench in the corridor outside the research building. The autumn sun had begun casting long shadows beneath the fiery red trees. She sat upright, hands interlocked in her lap, eyes drifting through the glass as if counting time by the way light moved across the floor. Her notebook lay in the bag beside her, spine bent, a smudge of chalk dust on the corner. At the end of the hallway, a door opened. Elena Morales stepped out first, followed by 2 others, an older white male professor and a gray-haired woman, academic director of the university. Morales walked straight to her. "No small talk. The committee wants to meet you." Clarice stood slowly, heavy with the weight of years. She had never spoken aloud. The conference room had only 6 people, but the air was thick, like a Senate hearing in miniature. A bald man fired the first question the moment she sat. "Where did you study?" Clarice met his gaze. "Community college in Cleveland. I dropped out after 2 semesters, had a baby. Worked full-time in custodial services ever since." A woman across the table asked, "So the work in your notebook, it's all self-taught?" Clarice nodded. "I read discarded textbooks from the library. Sometimes I could download open access papers. I'd redo the theorems and proofs, by hand." The man at the head of the table flipped through the notebook they had been reviewing. His brow kept furrowing. "Elena says you made a discovery equivalent to an unpublished quantum technique." Morales nodded. "Not just equivalent. She also found 2 transformation reductions that are more efficient than our current model at MIT." A hush spread across the room. No one was looking at Clarice as an outsider anymore. The academic director folded her hands on the table. "We'd like to offer you an exception, an honorary fellowship. You'll bypass traditional admission. Join the Advanced Applied Mathematics program next semester." Clarice didn't answer right away, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood her next words would redefine her entire life. Why, she asked quietly. Morales tilted her head. "Because talent shouldn't be swept away with dust on the hallway floor." Clarice still didn't nod. Then the bald man cut in. "You need to understand, this isn't pity. This is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. Once you're in, you'll be scrutinized more than any student here." "Are you ready for that?" Clarice looked around the room. 43 years old, a life lived in silence, a mind hidden behind face masks and mop handles. She knew there'd be whispers, skeptical glances, dismissive stares. But that wasn't new to her. She nodded. "I don't need a shortcut, just a door that isn't locked." The director smiled. Not wide, but genuine. Morales leaned in, touched her hand gently. "Welcome to the university." The news traveled faster than Clarice expected. Not through headlines, no articles named her, but through the students who had been there that day. On an internal forum, someone posted a photo of her chalk-filled solution. Someone else made a meme, Clarice's Law, Drake's Pride. As for Drake, he remained silent. No press statements, no official protest. But in the academic hallways, rumors swirled. Some said he'd filed for early retirement. Others claimed he was writing an 18-page rebuttal to reclaim his reputation. Clarice didn't care. She still cleaned the same floors, only now, during her night shifts. A few students quietly nodded when she passed. No one pretended not to see her anymore. And for Clarice, that was enough. Clarice Hampton's first class didn't take place in a grand lecture hall. It happened in an old lab on the third floor of the engineering building, where the pipes still hissed faintly in the walls, and the flickering fluorescent lights pulsed like the aging breath of a system long forgotten. 18 students were present. 16 were male. 3 of them had been at the symposium the day she was mocked. No one laughed today. Clarice walked in wearing her familiar gray cardigan, but this time, her hands didn't hold a mop, only a book bag, a whiteboard marker, and a fresh notebook with blank pages. She wrote the first line on the board: mathematics is not about solving problems. It's about seeing what no one else dares to. Not a sound. Before we begin, she said, her voice calm and warm, I need you to understand something. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because someone thought I couldn't be. A student in the front row leaned forward. We've read about you. Is it true you've never formally studied information theory? Clarice smiled lightly. Never sat in a class. But I once wiped down a board that had it written all over it. The room laughed, not in mockery, but in relief. The kind of laugh that meant a wall between them and her had just cracked. Weeks later, in a faculty meeting, Elena Morales made a proposal: add Clarice to the core quantum research team. She has no degree. A senior faculty member protested. That violates internal policy. Morales didn't flinch. But she has solutions we don't. What policy protects mediocrity over brilliance? No one had an answer. Clarice was granted status as an honorary research associate. No titles, no official badges, but for the first time, her name appeared on the university's internal database, listed beside the very people who once ignored her in the halls. Months passed. The university hosted a public outreach day. Clarice was invited to teach a guest session on applied mathematics to a group of high school students from underserved neighborhoods in the city. She stood before 30 kids, mostly black and brown, thin-framed, dressed in worn jackets, and asked, Has anyone here ever felt like they weren't smart enough to be in a room like this? Nearly half raised their hands. Clarice walked to the board, drew a line, and wrote 2 large words: not true. Being smart isn't something you prove with a degree, she said. It's something you keep, even when no one sees it. She didn't like being on the news, refused interviews. When a television producer asked to film a documentary about her life, she declined with one quiet sentence. I don't need the spotlight. I just don't want to be erased. And then one day, a student placed a small plaque outside the research room where she worked. A simple brass nameplate. It read, Clarice Hampton, Department of Applied Mathematics, former custodian, lifelong mathematician. Clarice stood before it for a long moment. Not because it was grand, but because after all those years walking as a shadow down the hallway, her name was now exactly where it belonged. That night, she stayed late, crossing the quad in the chill of winter wind. Clarice paused beneath the window of the main building. Inside the old lecture hall, the very one where Drake had once humiliated her, a night class was in session. A student was presenting. There was light. There was laughter. No one turned to look at her this time, but she stood there, not to revisit the past, but to confirm something simple. She had walked beyond it. She smiled, just slightly, and turned to go. The shadow she cast across the old bricks was no longer the shadow of someone forgotten. It was the shadow of someone who had just rewritten how the world recognizes genius.